covered 4 verses, so I'm going to try more than 4 verses, and I think we'll be able to. We spent a tremendous amount of time last week just kind of setting the stage for chapter 6 and really the rest of Revelation. I mentioned last Sunday morning that chapter 6 was one of those chapters that was very controversial, and unfortunately there was a tremendous amount of misinterpretation about chapter 6. Hopefully we cleared some of that up. And the 3 big problems with a lot of people just not understanding or misinterpreting chapter 6 and a whole lot of Revelation. Number 1, they forgot what we call the nature of the apocalyptic style. Very, very symbolic and based on the past, based on history, secondly, and also based on Old Testament prophecy. And so we spent a lot of time going back and looking at Roman history, and we also spent a lot of time back in the Old Testament, and we'll do so today. Now let's just review very, very quickly what we looked at last Sunday morning. We talked about that we're introduced to what we call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, there are a lot of people who didn't understand that, but we said we had seen these horsemen before back in the Old Testament. Do you remember where it was? Zechariah, very good. Back in Zechariah had been commissioned by God to come back with the Jews that had been exiled in Babylon after the Babylonian conquest and deportation of these Jews back to Babylon, back to Mesopotamia in 605, 597, and 586 BC. But a new emperor came along, a new empire came along and conquered Babylon, we said. Do you remember which empire that was? The Medo-Persian Empire. Very, very good. And the emperor, Cyrus, he decided that he would send the Jews back, not just out of the goodness of his heart, but he said if they want to go back, we'll let them go back, and hopefully they'll be loyal to the Medo-Persian Empire because of what we've done. Some Jews went back, some didn't. And then under Darius, the next emperor, he continued the same thing. Zechariah was commissioned by God to go back with them. And do you remember he had a specific job? Rebuild the temple. Very good. Rebuild the temple. There was a problem though. They ran into some the Jews and Zechariah and Haggai, the next prophet that had the same job. They ran into some major problems when they got back to the land of Palestine or Canaan or Israel, whatever you want to call it. What was the problem? Excellent. There were other folks that had moved in when they had been exiled to Mesopotamia. And so they were constantly being harassed and attacked and browbeaten by the inhabitants that were there. We talked about that's the basis of the Middle Eastern problem today. Same exact problem. That's where it started. And they're despondent, these Jews. They're crushed. And Zechariah, he has a vision from God in that first chapter we looked at. And in that vision, he saw these horsemen on different colored horses. And the message, we'll just cut to the chase, was very simple. God sometimes allows evil to accomplish his final purpose. And we talked about the similarities and looked about that. And so particularly these Jewish Christians in the Roman Empire, they would have reflected back. They've seen those horsemen before. And the whole point of the message was, who was in control? God was. He might allow evil from time to time to accomplish his end game. And we even went back to Job, the 2nd chapter. We saw the same thing in Job. You know, when Satan came and told God, you inflict this punishment on Job and he'll curse you. God says, I'm not going to do it, but I will allow you. But what did he do? He limited him. Very good. And we saw the same thing last week when we looked at the first of those 2 horsemen of the apocalypse, as we called it. The first horse comes along, lots of controversy. Because this first horse, you remember what color it was? White. The first one was white. And there was a rider that sat on it. And a lot of people say, well, this obviously is Jesus. Well, we all looked at, obviously it is not. Why would it not be Jesus? Several reasons. Even though he's got a crown, even though he's on a white horse, we see the same picture of or same symbolic representation later on in Revelation, but in this case it couldn't be Jesus. Why?
One thing, Jesus was calling them to come out.
Exactly. Each one of these four horsemen, one of the four living spirits, which is representative of God's holiness, says you can come out. So we see that control. What else? Good point. Exactly. The Greek word that would symbolize the Supreme One is not capitalized. It's smaller case, lowercase. And so that's another real good hint. Why else? Exactly. And you couple him with the other horsemen, they're all evil. They're all inflicting pain and hurt on people. And Jesus doesn't do that. And then we talked about when we went back and we looked historically, we looked back and these folks in the Roman Empire, they understood the symbolism. Because this horseman, this cavalryman, if you will call him that, they thought immediately of an empire that constantly were a pain in the side of the Roman Empire. They vexed the Roman Empire for years and years and years. Remember the name of them? Parthians, from way back east. And they constantly were invading, and they constantly were causing all kinds of tribulation in the Roman Empire. And the thing that really sets us apart, they were the only major empire military in antiquity. They were all archers. They were all bow and arrow people. And this guy on this white horse, this cavalryman, he had a bow. And also we talked about there was a major battle and my old age just said it. I don't remember the name of the battle now. But the Roman Empire, their legions walked in very, very confident. They're never defeated. And the Parthian cavalry attacked them and defeated them. And the thing that's unique, every one of the horsemen were on what color horse? White horse. And so both the internal and external evidence here suggests this represents war, external invasion. And Rome constantly was faced with that. There was always some external force that was rising up against them. Second horseman, he's on a what color horse? A red horse. Now in apocalyptic literature, red typically represented rebellion. Did Rome ever have to mess with rebellion? Constantly. Rome had conquered so wide an expanse of the world, the then known world. They had conquered everything. And some people didn't want to be conquered. And eventually they would rise up in rebellion. And the Romans were terrified, more than an external invasion. They were terrified of this rebellion. And it talks about, what gives us a hint right here, it talks about man fighting against man in the description of this red horse. And we talked about the fact Rome was so terrified that they had barred from other, particularly barbaric cultures, a form of execution to try to dissuade people from being rebellious. And that was what? Crucifixion. And we talked about last week, that was the Jews' trump card when Pilate said, I don't see anything wrong with this Jesus Christ. I don't see anything warranting death. And they said, he says he's king. And if you're a friend of Caesar, you won't put up with this rebellion. And that the cowardly Pilate, that's exactly what happened. Any questions before we move on? The next two horsemen, let me tell you, not nearly as controversial. I mean, everybody pretty well puts the same interpretation on the next two horsemen. But anything on these first two before we go on? Either I did a real good job last week, or y'all just say, look, you only cover 4 verses, go, move. The next horseman that we have here, beginning in verse 5, now notice I'm assuming in all of your versions, your translations, the he is capitalized. So that tells us that the Greek pronoun that was used is talking about whom? Jesus was. Very good. He broke the third seal, and I heard the third living creature say, "Come." Again, all four of these horsemen get the same. God says, "I'm in control, and I'll give you permission." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. Now, we can tell very immediately something's going to be measured or weighed or some type of interpretation here. The Romans, let me just tell you before we go any further, the Romans had pretty well, throughout the empire, tried to standardize weights and measurements. And you can understand why. I mean, because they were great economists, great traders, and because it was a worldwide empire, everything was pretty well standardized. So scales were very, very important. And they were used for measuring everything, precious metals, but particularly they were used to measure foodstuffs. And so this writer here, and we see the next verse or so, we see very clearly it's talking about food. It's talking particularly about grain, which was the substance of basically everything in the Roman Empire. Now, it starts out right here, a couple of terms we needed to find to really understand. It says, "And look, behold, a black horse. He sat on it with a pair of scales. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat.'" Now, again, we've got to go back to the original Greek. I've told you a zillion times I'm not a Greek scholar. But the original Greek, the word that's used here for a quart of wheat is choix. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Choerix. And choix was one of those Roman measurements that they had put in there, which basically referred to the amount of wheat that it took to make a small loaf of bread. And it was just standardized throughout the Roman Empire. A quart of wheat, or choix, used to make one small, and they say that historians of antiquity say, a very, very small loaf of bread. And he says that this quart of wheat, it cost a denarius. Now, what was a denarius? It was a Roman measurement of money, a monetary fee, and it was the standard wage, daily wage of a manual laborer. And when you're talking about a day's wage, it was for not an 8-hour day, but typically sunrise to sunset. A denarius, a denarii, plural, was used to standardize wages across the Roman Empire. Now think about that for a minute. What does that tell you for a whole day of long, hard, 12-hour probably labor? It cost that to buy one little small loaf of bread, or the makings of one small. What does that tell you? Famine. Boy, food is precious. Food is in short supply. And then it talks about barley. You know, the next same measurement that it talks about here. I don't know what the Greek word for this was, but barley wasn't considered to be as special a bread as the wheat was. So it cost a tremendous amount of money. There's a tremendous amount of famine going on. Was that unusual in the Roman Empire? Now, when you look around that Mediterranean world, it was all agrarian, of course, by and large, and it's basically an arid part of the world. And people, the Roman Empire, and these people all through these areas were constantly dealing with famine. Do you remember anywhere in the New Testament we talk about a major famine? You remember 1 Corinthians? The Apostle Paul is chastising the Corinthian church because they haven't done what? They haven't helped the Jewish Christians, the Christians in Jerusalem, because they're starving to death. The other churches, particularly the church at Thessalonica, they've taken up big contributions above and beyond what they were able to do. But the Corinthians, they haven't done anything. And famine had set in, and it was because the historians tell us there was a massive drought that had hit. We can kind of relate to that a little bit. Not the famine so much, but the drought we can relate to. But people were starving. Again, Rome couldn't do anything about it. That was something beyond Rome's capability. And look at that very last phrase right there. He says, and do not damage the oil and the wine. What does that tell you? Exactly. What happened was, when you talk about the wine and the oil, the regions apparently, there are some regions that weren't affected by the drought. And again, you see God putting limits on what evil can do. Move on to the fourth seal. This one is kind of fascinating as well. And we don't have to speculate on this one, the interpretation. Why? It tells us. It tells us here. This is one of those few places in Revelation that tells us exactly what the symbolism is. And the Lamb broke the fourth seal, and I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. Same thing, God's in control. I looked, and behold, an ashen horse. Now, some of your versions and translations probably say something different. Okay? Hell horse, okay? What else? Disease, okay. The pale horse or the ashen horse. Some translations, more contemporary versions, say sickly green horse. That gives you a visual picture, doesn't it? And here comes this horse. And it says, and he who sat on it had the name Death. We don't have to guess what this horseman is. Death. He goes on in that very name. And Hades. What is Hades? Exactly, a place of the dead. Some translations would say the grave. And so we see what many would say is man's greatest fear. And we see that God allows that. But again, we see that it's going to accomplish God's ultimate purpose of victory. He goes on. He says, and with him, authority was given to him. Again, the authority comes from whom? From God. Authority was given him over a fourth of the earth. So that tells us what? It's limited. It's limited. And then he goes on, he says to kill, and he kind of ties these other three horsemen, or these other three vexes that God has allowed to come into the world. He says, with the sword, that'd be warfare and or rebellion, and famine, and we just looked at that, and pestilence, that would be natural occurrences, and by wild beast of the earth. So we see all of this. Now, I'm thinking, wonder what these folks, the first century Christian audience, what they're thinking about this. And then when we see the fifth seal, we see the status of some of these people. And they've got a question that's going to come up. And I'm hazarding the guess that probably every one of us from time to time have asked the same question. And God's going to answer it. And this is where a very positive thing comes in. And when the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar. Let's talk about just a second an altar. What is an altar? What's it for? Worship? Sacrifice? And these Christians, as we're going to see, and we're going to see who they are, they're people that have sacrificed their lives or lost their lives for the faith. And you think about the four horsemen we just saw, some of them had probably lost their lives because of those things. Because of war, particularly in the Eastern Roman Empire where these Parthians were constantly invading, and other areas of invasion, rebellion, which went on, in AD 70, what did Rome do with Israel? They wiped Israel out, tore the temple down, and transported Jews just like the Assyrians had with Israel, just like the Babylonians had with Judah, all over the Roman Empire. And the Jews kind of revolted, and they wiped them out. I told you last week, the Romans even plowed salt into the ground in Israel to make sure nothing grew. And so they see this. It goes that they had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony that they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth. Can you see how that would be a response that they were having? Don't raise your hands. I'll raise mine. Have you ever felt that way? Lord, how long is this going to go on? Whether it's a health issue or a financial issue or a family issue or whatever. How long are you going to allow this to go on? And I'll give you a little hint. This is chapter 6, verse 10. In chapter 10, verse 6, God's going to answer that question. So just put that ahead of you when we get there in short order. How long is this going to go on? And then John's vision continues here. And there was given to each of them a white robe. A white robe. Now, this again was something that was well known in apocalyptic literature. In fact, there's one of those non-canonical books. Remember what we said that meant, non-canonical? Not in the canon, wasn't considered by the early church as divinely inspired. And it's called First Enoch. You know, it's referred to in Jude. But this book was not considered divinely inspired. But in First Enoch, let me see. I wrote down here, 62 verse 1. You might want, some of you are taking notes, you might want to jot it down. The saints are all given white robes in that non-inspired book, but it makes reference to it because these Christians, they was very, very popular. They knew what this book was all about. And what do we say? White robes represented purity and victory. Victory. We start the vision by seeing them sacrificed for their faith, put to death for their faith, but now they're seen as victorious. Same basic picture we saw back in Revelation chapter 4. They're victorious. And they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. In other words, God's plan, when it completely unfolds, there's not going to be any more evil. In fact, do you remember back when we looked at Revelation chapter 4, that in front of the throne of God, there was a sea that was calm and crystal and smooth, and nothing like seas always appeared in apocalyptic literature, both inspired works and non-canonical works. And the sea was always, in the Canaanite myth, was always representative of what? Trouble and evil and tumult and gloom and desire. And in front of God, it was smooth. And this is a foretaste of what we're going to see through the rest of Revelation, that God is going to take care of evil. The same message over and over and over again, but we're going to see as we continue through how God's going to take care of it in their lives and in our lives. Well, that pretty well finished up the fifth seal. The sixth seal is fascinating to me because we see God, when he takes vengeance, as they're crying about here, it is an awesome thing to uphold or to see. In Jeremiah, we won't turn back there because of time restrictions. Jeremiah 46 and following, there is a long, long list of the nations that have opposed God. We talked about that in Zechariah, when we talked about the 4 nations that had inflicted pain on Israel. They each had one horn, one power. Jesus introduced with 7. And we talked about, by the time that this was written by Zechariah, where were all 4 of those empires? They were gone. The Medo-Persians were still around, but they were declining rapidly. Well, Jeremiah, this even goes back before the final defeat of Judah by Babylon. And the nation of Babylon appears to be invincible, just like the Romans do right here in the 1st century. But Jeremiah goes back, again having the vision, and talks about every one of the nations that historically have plagued Israel. Every one of them. He talks about the Assyrians, talks about the Babylonians, he even makes reference figuratively to the Roman Empire. And in every one of them, what has God done to them? He destroyed them. And so that basically, this sixth seal is giving us some more symbolic reference that God is going to take care of evil. He's going to do it. You know, we read the scripture, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. And that's what this sixth seal is all about. Now, he starts out in a way that these people can completely understand it. I looked, and he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. Now, do y'all remember I talked about there are certain signals in Revelation and in all apocalyptic literature that when this sign shows up, it tells every one of us to do what? Pay attention. Something really big. We talked about the thunder, we talked about the lightning, and this is another one. And we see a lot of earthquakes as we move through the book of Revelation. Now, these people of the Roman Empire could sure understand earthquakes. In fact, just a handful of years before, a couple of decades before, there was a major earthquake that shook the Roman Empire to a core. Anybody remember what mountain erupted? Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius, outside of Rome. In fact, there was a very opulent, powerful, wealthy village that was completely annihilated. And that was what? Pompeii. In AD 69, Vesuvius erupted, and Pompeii was buried in ash. And in fact, the eruption was so traumatic, caused a massive earthquake. And when it did, the sky for weeks and weeks was blackened by the ash. So badly, historians say, that the crops failed, which ushered in even more horror with famine and destitution throughout the Roman Empire. And you see reference to this right here. And the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. You ever seen a lunar eclipse? What does that moon look like? It's red. You get smoke or ash or dust. Growing up in West Texas, I saw a lot of red moons. Not because of earthquakes, but because of sandstorms. A lot of red moons. Well, these people understand a cataclysmic event that's taking place here. And the stars in the sky fell to the ground, and the fig tree cast its unripe fruits when shaken by a great wind. Now, this has reference almost the same language in Isaiah, the 34th chapter. Isaiah uses the same language and talks about what's going to happen to Babylon. And these people knew it did. It did. And that word right there, shaken, the easiest way for me to remember what this symbolic concept of an earthquake is, God's going to shake things up. Someday, God, when timing's right, God's time is always right, God's going to shake things up. And I don't know about you, but when I stop and I think, someday there's not going to be any more evil. There's not going to be more war. There's not going to be more rebellion. There's not going to be more famine. There's not going to be more death. God's going to take care of it. You think that'll shake the world up? Oh, yeah. I kind of go back to the cross of Calvary. When Jesus died, what happened? Earthquake. Dead rose. Veil of the temples ripped from the top to the bottom. Yeah, I think, you think Israel was shaken up when that happened? I mean, even that old hardened centurion that's in who knows how many crucifixions he's overseen. This is God's son. This surely was the Son of God. That was right. And so we look at that, we see that God will shake things up. He says the sky was split apart like a scroll. Again, a reference, basically what had happened with the crucifixion. And it was rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now, there's a whole number of references that we could turn back to right now in the Old Testament, and we could look at this. Let's just go back to Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, for just a minute and see the same kind of thing. Isaiah, again, prophesying these folks in Israel. They're being attacked and exiled by the Babylonians. And let's just go back to Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, and let's begin in verse 19. Men will go in the caves of the rocks and into the holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. I think about that, where we're told by the Hebrew writer, it is a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God. And he makes reference to that right there. He says, when he arises to make the earth tremble. In that day men will cast away to the moles and the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold. What's that mean? All the things that man thinks precious, not going to matter a hill of beans, a spit in the river, whatever way you want to put it. It's not going to make a bit of difference, which they made for themselves to worship, in order to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs, before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he arises to make the earth tremble. Now again, that's reference to the resurrection of Jesus right there, which of course will be on the minds of many of us this week, next week as well. And Haggai, in fact, let's just turn Haggai to Haggai, the 2nd chapter. And I'll give you a minute to get there, because we don't spend a lot of time looking at Haggai, do we? Which is kind of a shame, these minor prophets. Haggai, the 2nd chapter. Again, he's talking about these Jews. Haggai is a contemporary of Zechariah, and they're there in the middle of the land of Canaan, trying to rebuild the temple with all of these problems coming and going constantly. The temple has pretty well stopped construction because of all the invasions. Verse 6 of Haggai, the 2nd chapter. For thus says the Lord of hosts, once more in a little while. Do you think that might help the spirits of these first century Christians? God's going to take care of it, but in his timing, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth, the sea also, and the dry land. I will shake all the nations, and they'll come with the wealth of all nations, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord of hosts. To these Christians, glory's coming. Now, that would kind of be hard with all the things that we've already talked about they're going through. It was the same with the Jews that had come back to the land of Canaan in the days of Zechariah and Haggai. It's true with these Christians, and it's probably true for some of us sometimes too. But the glory of the Lord is going to show up. Well, let's go back to our text in Revelation. And he uses that very same language here. The kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders, the word that is used here, the Latin word that's used here, translated in Greek, is chiliarch. The chiliarchs were Roman commanders that commanded groups of 1,000 soldiers. They made up the Roman legions. And in the minds of people of the ancient world, the Roman world, the legions couldn't be beaten. And these commanders were in charge of that. They were seen totally invulnerable. But they're including this as well. And the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They realize they're not in control anymore. And they realize who is in control. And if you look at the very last verse, or the last two verses, and they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For their great day of wrath has come. And look at that last phrase right there. Very, very important. Who is able to stand? Who's able to stand? What do you think the answer to that question is? Nobody on earth. But turn back. The answer is given us back in Hebrews 12th chapter. Hebrews, the 12th chapter. Hebrews is written primarily to Jewish Christians. And they're already suffering quite a bit of persecution, even though this is before Domitian. They've been suffering literally since the Neronian persecutions of the AD 60s. And I want to begin reading in verse 26 of Hebrews, the 12th chapter. And his voice shook the earth. You see the constant references to shaking, whether it's apocalyptic literature or, in this case, the Hebrew letter. And he prays, yet once again I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. Why is that significant? The earth and the heavens. Everything. God's in control of everything. Everything. The heavens. The place. There's nothing that God doesn't control. This expression, yet once more, denotes the removal of these things which can be shaken as are created, so that all these things which cannot be shaken may remain. Now where he says, once again, yet once more, that reference that he talks about right there is a direct quote from Haggai, the 2nd chapter that we just read. Verbatim. Same thing. Yet once more. God did it before. It's what the Hebrew writer said. And God will do it again. Evil's not going to last, like I've told you before. Some of you remember vividly World War II. And what was the great force of evil in World War II? Lots of it around. What was the Nazis? Yeah. Adolf Hitler. Man, you talk about evil. Joseph Stalin. Man, you talk about evil. Benito Mussolini. Talk about evil. Emperor Tojo. You talk about evil. I mean, you start going through all these names, and you think about it, particularly older people, they think about that. What happened to Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and Tojo? They're gone. They're gone. Nobody today fears Nazi Germany because it is no more. And even though Russia is still a concern, it's not the Soviet Union like it used to be. And Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy or the Empire of Japan, about the only ally we have in the Far East anymore. You think about all these things, and you look in your own life, or I do in mine. Think about what 20 years ago was your greatest fear. I'd hazard to guess it probably is not your greatest fear today. Because bad and evil and ungodliness, they come and go. But he talks about here, he says, godliness is where it should be. And I want you to continue. Therefore, remember the question that we asked at the end of chapter 6? What was the question? Who could stand? And the Hebrew writer answers it right here. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken. What does that mean? It stands firm. It can't be destroyed because that's God's kingdom. That's Jesus' kingdom. It cannot be destroyed. Let us show, and I love this, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. He says to the Hebrew writer, or the audience, and same thing that John's saying through God's divine intervention to the first century Jewish audience, Christian audience, not Jewish, the Christian audience as a whole. Be thankful that you belong to the kingdom. Be thankful you cannot be beaten. You cannot be shaken. You cannot be destroyed. You have victory. Okay, we're going to stop right there as far as our text goes. And we've got about just a very few minutes. Any questions or comments? I've intentionally tried to do a lot of the talking this morning to move as we move on through chapter 6. Any questions or comments about what we've looked at? I started to make a comment about I'm trying to overcome the Carlin Branson effect. On Wednesday nights, I'm being facetious because Carlin is a great teacher, and it was a tremendous study of the book of Romans. But we did take a little while. But it was worthwhile, to say the very least. And I wanted to move a little bit more quickly because we got lots and lots of revelation left in front of us, and we'll continue as long as you all want to continue. But anyway, anything you'd like to say? Yes, ma'am. The 12th chapter.
Okay.
You find it? Okay, very good. Any other questions or comments? And like I say, anytime you need me to clarify where I am, because as I say, I'm moving pretty.
Yeah, all this stuff in the Old Testament and you are tied together. And if you know the Old Testament, then it just makes it a lot easier.
Exactly. Good point, Bill. Bill, if you couldn't hear, he said it's amazing how the things in the Old Testament are tied into what we're studying right now. And as I've said on and on, if you don't understand some of these basics from the Old Testament, you're not going to understand Revelation. It's impossible to really get the full impact of Revelation. And the thing that's fascinating to me is the more I study it, and I think this is about the 5th time that I've taught the book as a whole, I've learned so much just the last few weeks going back and studying one more time and seeing things that I had never really seen before, both historically and scripturally. And so it's just, I think I could spend the rest of my life just studying the book of Revelation and find something new every single day. Bill, good point. Very good point. Any other comment or question this morning? Well, I know good and well that down the road I'm going to run over. So I'm looking at my watch. I'm going to give you 3 minutes this morning, okay? Now, somebody filed that away that when I run over 3 minutes, I don't want to hear you griping, okay? Because on the 22nd of March, I gave you 3 minutes. So by my calculation, I'm ahead. So we'll stop right there. Thank y'all so much for being here this morning. Appreciate your input and thanks for your help.